What happens to women sentenced to die? While executions of female inmates are rare, some have met their fate while others continue to wait on death row. Donald Trump's presidency has overseen the sentencing and execution of several women, drawing controversy and debate. Today, we uncover their stories, their crimes, their final meals, and their last words. Stay tuned to learn the chilling details. Lisa Montgomery, State, Indiana, execution date, January 13, 2021.
A family member found the 23-year-old woman. Investigators say someone murdered that mother and took her unborn child.
Lisa Montgomery was convicted of the brutal 2004 murder of Bobby Jo Stinnett, a 23-year-old pregnant woman from Skidmore, Missouri. Posing as an interested buyer for a rat terrier puppy, Montgomery arranged a meeting with Stinnett at her home. Once inside, Montgomery attacked Stinnett, strangling her with a rope until she fell unconscious. Using a kitchen knife, Montgomery cut open Stinnett's abdomen, removed the premature baby, and fled the scene, leaving the young mother to die. Montgomery then attempted to pass off the stolen baby as her own, calling her husband to claim she had gone into labor while on a shopping trip. Authorities quickly linked Montgomery to the crime through online messages exchanged with Stinnett before the attack. She was arrested the next day at her home in Kansas, where officers safely recovered the newborn. During her trial, Montgomery's defense argued that she suffered from severe mental illness, including bipolar disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, stemming from a lifetime of sexual abuse and trauma. However, prosecutors maintained that her actions were deliberate and calculated, driven by her false pregnancy claims and a desperate attempt to maintain a relationship with her then-husband. She was convicted in 2007 and sentenced to death, making her the first woman in the U.S. to receive a federal death sentence in nearly 50 years. Montgomery's execution was set for December 2020, but it was postponed after her attorneys contracted COVID-19 while working on her case. Her defense team continued to push for clemency, arguing that her history of brain damage, mental illness, and childhood trauma made her ineligible for execution. However, in the final days of Donald Trump's first presidency, which was between 2017 to 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court lifted the stays of execution, allowing them to proceed. At 1:31 a.m. on January 13, 2021, Montgomery was executed by lethal injection in the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. She became the first woman to be federally executed since 1953. For her last meal, Montgomery requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and a strawberry milkshake. As she lay strapped to the execution gurney, when asked for final words, she responded, "No." Moments later, she was pronounced dead. Lisa Jo Chamberlain, State, Mississippi, sentencing, death row. Lisa Jo Chamberlain was convicted of the 2004 double homicide of Linda Heinzelman and Heinzelman's boyfriend, Emmett L. Miller, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The murders were particularly gruesome. Chamberlain and her accomplice, Roger Gillett, who was also her boyfriend, beat, tortured, and ultimately killed the victims inside their home. After the killings, the pair attempted to dismember and hide the bodies by placing them inside a freezer at an abandoned farm property in Kansas. The crime was discovered when authorities, searching for stolen property linked to Gillett, uncovered the remains. In 2006, both Chamberlain and Gillett were convicted of capital murder. Chamberlain received the death penalty, making her the first and only woman on Mississippi's death row. Gillett was also sentenced to death, but later had his sentence reduced to life without parole after a successful appeal. Lisa Jo Chamberlain remains the only woman on Mississippi's death row, housed at the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility. Chamberlain's original death sentence was overturned in 2015 after a federal court ruled that prosecutors had unfairly excluded black jurors from her trial. She continues to appeal her conviction and file motions for clemency as she awaits trial. Tiffany Cole, State, Florida, Sentencing: death row. Tiffany Cole was convicted for her role in the 2005 kidnapping, robbery, and murder of an elderly couple, James and Carol Sumner, in Jacksonville, Florida. The Sumners, who were in their 60s, had been longtime family friends of Cole. She and her accomplices, Michael Jackson, Bruce Nixon, and Alan Wade, devised a plan to rob the couple after realizing they had recently sold their home and had access to a large sum of money. The group lured the couple from their home, bound them with duct tape, and forced them into the trunk of their own car. They were then driven to a remote wooded area in Charlton County, Georgia, where they were buried alive in a shallow grave. Tiffany Cole's role in the crime included renting the vehicle used in the abduction, conducting surveillance on the couple beforehand, helping to dig the grave, and spending the victims' money after their deaths. She was arrested in South Carolina along with her co-conspirators. In 2007, Cole was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Due to the brutality of the crime, she was sentenced to death, making her one of the youngest women ever sent to death row in the U.S. However, Tiffany Cole remains on Florida's death row at Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida. She is one of only a few women awaiting execution in the state. Cole has challenged her death sentence multiple times, arguing that she was under the influence of her accomplices and that she played a minor role in the crime. In 2017, the Florida Supreme Court upheld her conviction and death sentence. Cole's latest appeals are still pending, and her execution date is yet to be set. Melissa Lucio. State: Texas. Sentencing: death row. Melissa Lucio was convicted in 2008 for the 2007 death of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah Alvarez, in Harlingen, Texas. Prosecutors claimed that Lucio abused Mariah over time, leading to a fatal head injury. However, Lucio has consistently maintained her innocence, stating that Mariah's death was the result of a tragic accident. According to Lucio, Mariah fell down a steep staircase outside their apartment 2 days before her death, which led to her injuries. Lucio's conviction was largely based on a controversial police interrogation just hours after her daughter's death, where she appeared to confess under pressure, in which no eyewitnesses testified to seeing Lucio abuse her children. Medical experts later challenged the prosecution's claims, arguing that Mariah's injuries were consistent with a fall, not intentional abuse. Despite no prior history of child abuse, Lucio was sentenced to death in 2008, thereby becoming the first Hispanic woman on Texas death row. However, Melissa Lucio remains on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. However, her execution, originally scheduled for April 27, 2022, was stalled by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals to review new evidence that may prove her innocence. In April 2022, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay of execution and ordered a review of her case due to new evidence like the expert testimony that Mariah's injuries were not caused by abuse, allegations that prosecutors suppressed evidence in her trial, and concerns that her confession was coerced. That made Lucio receives widespread support from activists, celebrities, and lawmakers, including Kim Kardashian, Innocence Project, and state legislators calling for her exoneration. However, the court is currently reviewing Lucio's case, whether she deserves a new trial. If her conviction is overturned, she could be removed from death row or even released, and if the court upholds her conviction, Texas could set a new execution date in the future. Lucio's case has sparked national debate, with many believing she was wrongfully convicted. Darlie Routier, State, Texas. Sentencing: death row. On June 6, 1996, Darlie Routier called 911 from her home in Rowlett, Texas, reporting that an intruder had broken in and stabbed her 2 sons, 6-year-old Devin Routier and 5-year-old Damon Routier. She also had injuries, including a superficial neck wound and cuts on her arms, which she claimed were from struggling against the attacker. However, when police arrived, They found inconsistencies in her story and physical evidence that raised suspicion. Damon was still alive when paramedics arrived, but later died from multiple stab wounds. Devon had already succumbed to his injuries. The prosecution argued that the crime scene was staged to look like a break-in, with a slit window screen as the only sign of forced entry. Blood evidence suggested that Routier herself had inflicted her wounds after attacking her sons. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a surveillance video of Routier celebrating at her son's gravesite with silly string just days after the murders, a moment the prosecution used to portray her as cold and remorseless. Despite maintaining her innocence and insisting that an intruder was responsible, Routier was convicted in 1997 for the murder of Damon Routier. Although she was also accused of killing Devon, she was only tried for one murder. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection and has been on Texas death row for over 25 years. Darlie Routier remains on death row as she continues to fight her conviction. Her legal team has pushed for additional DNA testing and forensic reviews in an effort to prove her claims of innocence. Blanche Taylor Moore. State, North Carolina. Sentencing, death row. Blanche Taylor. Moore was convicted of the 1986 arsenic poisoning murder of her husband, Reverend Dwight Moore. Their relationship seemed normal at first, but shortly after their marriage, Dwight began suffering from severe, unexplained illness, including vomiting, weakness, and intense pain. Doctors initially struggled to diagnose him, but further testing revealed lethal levels of arsenic in his system. Miraculously, Dwight survived, but suspicion soon led authorities to investigate Blanche's past. What they uncovered was a chilling pattern of mysterious deaths among the men in her life. Blanche's first husband, James Napoleon Taylor, had died in 1973 under circumstances initially believed to be natural. Similarly, her longtime boyfriend, Raymond Reed, suffered a prolonged, agonizing illness before dying in 1986. Even her father, Parker Kaiser, had died under suspicious conditions. When investigators exhumed the bodies of Taylor and Reed, toxicology reports confirmed arsenic poisoning at levels hundreds of times the lethal dose. Arrested in 1989, Blanche was only tried for the murder of Raymond Reed, but was widely suspected in multiple killings. She was convicted in 1990 and sentenced to death by lethal injection, making her North Carolina's only woman on death row. Now in her late 80s, Blanche Taylor Moore remains on death row at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. Due to ongoing legal delays and North Carolina's unofficial moratorium on executions, her execution is yet to be scheduled. Carrie Lynn Dalton, State, California, sentencing, death row. In 1988, Carrie Lynn Dalton, a methamphetamine user and dealer, became convinced that her acquaintance Irene May had stolen drugs from her. Enraged, she allegedly plotted a horrific night of torture and murder inside a mobile home in Lakeside, California. According to witness testimonies, Dalton and two accomplices, Sharon Cox and George Haynes, subjected May to hours of extreme brutality. Witnesses claimed that May was beaten with a frying pan, stabbed multiple times, injected with battery acid, and even struck with a hammer. Despite the gruesome allegations, no physical evidence was ever recovered because Irene May's body was never found. The case relied heavily on testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen or heard about the crime. Dalton was not arrested until 1992, 4 years after the murder, when investigators compiled enough witness statements to build a case against her. In 1995, she was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture and sentenced to death. Her co-defendants, Cox and Haynes, received lesser sentences and were not given the death penalty. Carrie Lynn Dalton remains on California's death row, and due to California's moratorium on executions, her execution has not been scheduled, and she continues to appeal her conviction. Kimberly Cargill, State, Texas, sentencing, death row. In 2010, Kimberly Cargill, a mother of 4 from White House, Texas, was convicted of murdering Cherry Walker, her 39-year-old babysitter, in a desperate attempt to silence her before she could testify in a pending child custody and injury to a child case against Cargill. Walker, who had cognitive disabilities, had been subpoenaed to testify in court about Cargill's history of abuse and neglect toward her children. On the night of June 18, 2010, Cargill picked up Walker under the guise of having a discussion. Instead, she forced or tricked Walker into consuming a lethal dose of medication, likely an overdose of Xanax, which left her incapacitated. Cargill then drove Walker's unconscious body to a secluded area in Smith County, Texas, where she doused her in lighter fluid and set her on fire in an attempt to destroy any forensic evidence. The following morning, Walker's badly burned body was discovered near a county road, with no direct physical evidence linking Cargill to the crime scene. However, investigators quickly turned their attention to Cargill due to her past history of violence, neglect, and controlling behavior, especially in legal matters involving her children. Testimonies from former acquaintances and ex-husbands revealed a disturbing pattern of physical abuse, manipulative behavior, and a willingness to eliminate obstacles in her way. A forensic pathologist confirmed that Walker had died before she was set on fire, and toxicology reports suggested she had been heavily sedated. In 2012, a jury found Cargill guilty of capital murder, determining that she had premeditated the killing to prevent Walker from testifying against her. She was sentenced to death. Kimberly Cargill remains on Texas's death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville. She has appealed her conviction, arguing ineffective counsel and mental health issues, but her sentence remains upheld. Due to the slow pace of executions in Texas, she has not yet been given an execution date. Patricia Blackman. State, Alabama. Sentencing, death row. Patricia Blackman was convicted of the brutal murder of her 2-year-old adopted daughter, Dominiqua Bryant, in Dothan, Alabama in 1999. The case was one of extreme child abuse, with evidence showing that the toddler had suffered repeated beatings and severe trauma before her death. On the night of May 29, 1999, Blackman called 911, claiming her child was not breathing. When paramedics arrived at her home, they found Dominiqua's body covered in bruises, abrasions, and deep wounds. The autopsy revealed that the child had suffered multiple skull fractures, broken bones, and severe internal injuries, signs of long-term abuse rather than a single act of violence. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma. Investigators determined that Blackman had viciously beaten the child with a metal object, believed to be a tennis shoe, and struck her multiple times. Blood evidence indicated that Dominiqua had been repeatedly slammed against a hard surface. Testimonies from medical experts painted a horrifying picture of prolonged suffering. Despite Blackman's claims that she had only spanked the child as discipline, the overwhelming forensic evidence contradicted her defense. The prosecution argued that the attack was deliberate, prolonged, and cruel, leading to Blackman's conviction for capital murder in 2002. The jury sentenced her to death, making her one of the few women on Alabama's death row. Patricia Blackman remains incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama, awaiting execution. Like many on death row, she has pursued appeals to overturn her sentence, citing claims of ineffective legal counsel and challenging the validity of the death penalty in her case. However, as of now, her execution remains pending, with no set date. Robin Lee Rowe, State, Idaho. Sentencing, death row. Robin Rowe orchestrated one of the most cold-blooded crimes in Idaho's history. On February 10, 1992, she intentionally set fire to her family's duplex in Boise, Idaho, while her husband, Randy Rowe, 34, and their 2 children, Joshua, 10, and Tabitha, 8, were inside sleeping. All 3 died of smoke inhalation, trapped in the burning home. Suspicion quickly fell on Robin when investigators discovered the fire had been intentionally set, with multiple points of origin indicating arson. Further investigation uncovered an even darker motive: financial gain. Authorities learned that Robin had recently taken out large life insurance policies on her husband and children, totaling over $250,000. This led police to conclude that she had murdered her family to cash in on the payouts. Shockingly, this was not the first tragedy in Robin's life. Years earlier, her first child, Keith, had died under suspicious circumstances, with authorities later suspecting foul play. Additionally, Robin had a history of fraud, financial deception, and mental health issues. In 1993, she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, becoming the only woman on Idaho's death row. The judge called her crimes the most egregious he had ever seen and stated that her lack of remorse warranted the harshest punishment. Robin Rowe remains incarcerated at Pocatello Women's Correctional Center. Despite decades of appeals and legal challenges, her death sentence still stands. However, due to Idaho's slow execution process, she has not yet been given an execution date. Bonnie Heady, State, Missouri. Execution date: December 18, 1953. Bonnie Heady and her accomplice, Carl Austin Hall, carried out one of the most infamous child kidnappings in American history. On September 28, 1953, they kidnapped 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease, the son of a wealthy automobile dealer in Kansas City, Missouri. Posing as the boy's aunt, Heady lured Bobby out of school, claiming his mother had suffered a heart attack. Once they had the child, the couple demanded a $600,000 ransom, one of the largest in U.S. history at the time. Bobby's family paid the ransom, but the boy was already dead. Hall and Heady had brutally murdered him soon after the abduction, shooting him in the head before burying his body in Heady's backyard in St. Joseph, Missouri. Their plan unraveled when Carl Hall carelessly flaunted his sudden wealth in St. Louis, attracting police attention. Authorities arrested the couple, and under questioning, they quickly confessed. Given the brutality of the crime and the murder of a child, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. Both Heady and Hall pleaded guilty without a jury trial, and in November 1953, they were sentenced to death in the gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary. On December 18, 1953, Bonnie Heady and Carl Hall were executed together in the gas chamber, the first and only couple in U.S. history to be put to death simultaneously. Their execution was carried out within seconds of each other, marking a grim chapter in American criminal history. Angela McAnulty, State, Oregon. Sentencing: February 1, 2011. Angela McAnulty was convicted of the brutal torture and murder of her 15-year-old daughter, Jeanette Maples, in Eugene, Oregon. The case was one of the worst child abuse cases in the state's history, shocking investigators, prosecutors, and the public alike. Jeanette had suffered years of extreme abuse, neglect, and starvation at the hands of her mother. Witnesses testified that McAnulty repeatedly beat and tortured Jeanette, often withholding food, forcing her to do grueling exercises as punishment, and keeping her isolated from the outside world. On December 9, 2009, emergency responders arrived at their home after receiving a call that Jeanette was unresponsive. What they found was horrifying. Jeanette was severely emaciated, covered in bruises, open wounds, and scars from prolonged beatings. Despite efforts to revive her, she died from her injuries. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence of systematic abuse. The medical examiner testified that Jeanette's injuries showed years of severe physical torture. Even McAnulty's husband, Richard, admitted to witnessing the abuse but failed to intervene. He later pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. McAnulty pleaded guilty in exchange for avoiding a lengthy trial. In 2011, she was sentenced to death, making her Oregon's only woman on death row at the time. However, in 2022, her sentence was commuted to life without parole, following Oregon's move away from capital punishment. Linda Carty, State, Texas. Sentencing date: February 19, 2002. Linda Carty, a British national, was convicted for the 2001 abduction and murder of 25-year-old Joanna Rodriguez in Houston, Texas. Prosecutors argued that Carty masterminded the kidnapping and killing because she wanted to steal Rodriguez's newborn baby. According to court documents, Carty recruited 3 men to help her carry out the crime. On May 16, 2001, they broke into Rodriguez's apartment, tied up her partner, and forced Rodriguez and her newborn son into a car. The baby was later found alive in a parked vehicle, but Rodriguez had been suffocated to death. Her body was discovered in the trunk of a car with a plastic bag over her head. Investigators quickly linked Carty to the crime. Witnesses testified that she had been desperate for a baby and had even pretended to be pregnant in the months before the murder. Prosecutors also presented evidence that Carty had planned the kidnapping as a way to take the newborn and raise him as her own. Carty was sentenced to death on February 19, 2002, becoming the only British citizen on death row in the U.S. Since then, her case has drawn international attention, with human rights organizations and the UK government advocating for a retrial, citing concerns over ineffective legal representation and possible misconduct. Her legal team continues to fight for her sentence to be overturned, arguing that she did not receive a fair trial and that key evidence was not properly presented. However, as of now, her death sentence remains in place. Margaret Allen, State, Florida. Sentencing. Date: May 19, 2011. Margaret Allen was convicted of the brutal torture and murder of her housekeeper, Wenda Wright, in 2005. The crime stemmed from Allen's false belief that Wright had stolen money from her purse. Allen, who was a known drug dealer in Brevard County, Florida, had a reputation for being violent and controlling. After noticing money missing from her purse, she immediately accused Wright of theft. Allen then dragged Wright into the garage, where she and an accomplice, James Martin, subjected her to hours of torture and interrogation. During the ordeal, Allen beat Wright, stomped on her neck, and poured cleaning chemicals down her throat, hoping to force a confession. Despite Wright pleading for her life and denying any involvement in the alleged theft, Allen showed no mercy. Ultimately, she strangled Wright to death with a belt, forcing a 17-year-old boy who was present to assist in the killing. After the murder, Allen and Martin wrapped Wright's body in garbage bags and buried her in a shallow grave near a wooded area in Port St. John, Florida. To avoid suspicion, Allen even asked her friend, a sheriff's deputy, how long it would take for a body to decompose. The crime remained unsolved for months until a witness came forward, revealing Allen's chilling confession. Witnesses testified that Allen bragged about the murder, stating she felt like a monster, but did what she had to do. The authorities later uncovered Wright's remains, leading to Allen's arrest and conviction. In 2011, after being found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping, Allen was sentenced to death, and despite multiple appeals, her death sentence remains in place. Margaret Allen died on December 13, 2024, at the age of 58 while still awaiting execution. At the time of her death, she was one of only 2 women on Florida's death row. The Florida Department of Corrections did not immediately release the cause of death, but officials stated that she passed away at Lowell Correctional Institution, where she had been held for over a decade. Her death effectively ended any remaining legal battles she had been fighting to overturn her sentence. These women committed shocking crimes that led to the ultimate punishment before and during Donald Trump's presidency. Their final meals and last words provide a chilling look into their last moments. If you found this deep dive interesting and want more cases like this, hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime insights.